Good afternoon, everybody, except for those of you on the West Coast, then good morning. We're just going to get started in just a minute here. Give everybody a little bit of time to get in the room and then we'll get started. But I did want to jump in and welcome everybody to our Registered Apprenticeship Program webinar series and get us started today. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Jen Amburn. I am with Women in Manufacturing, and one of my specialties with Women in Manufacturing is talking about registered apprenticeship programs, why they're important for both employees and employers, and how it could be mutual beneficial for both. So we'll get started in just a minute. I still see some people coming in, so just hang on to your hats and then we'll get started. But today's topic is going to be, so you want to start a registered apprenticeship program, but how? That's always the number one question that we get from employers all the time is how to start, where to begin, and going from there. So it looks like we got a good number of people logged in and we'll catch up on everybody else, but I did want to share a video with you first.
I think when I'm talking with companies and they may be interested in it, the important thing for me to remind them is people today just can't afford not to have employment, right? And yet employers are screaming and saying, we need people with skills, we need the right skills. Doing a custom apprenticeship, they're able to develop the program into what they need as an employer and give the employee a chance to not only have employment while they're learning, but also to have those incremental pay increases so they know there's, it's a growing thing for them.
I think the apprenticeship is really going to help my family life one day because I also can make a good income now. So it's not just relying on my husband or relying on somebody else. We have two good incomes, and I think that's really going to help because a lot of females, I think, don't think that they can go into trades that you can make a lot of good money in, but you can if you just put your mind to it, and it's really helpful when you have two solid incomes.
The apprenticeship program has helped me in my personal life by allowing me to complete my degree without student loans. I have 0 loans, which is an amazing thing to say and an amazing thing to feel, especially at 23 years old. And the financial benefits have been fantastic because I've also been able to buy a house this year.
The apprenticeship program has helped me in my family life in more of a financial way, first of all, because it did help me get my first associate's degree at a university for free, and that was a huge difference for us. And now, as my husband and I are expecting, it let us buy our first home when we got married. So I actually was a homeowner at 19 years old, which is pretty rare. So that has really helped. I also make a very nice wage for myself at the age I am, and it's also, I've been a full-time employee, so I have a retirement plan already set up and everything, and I'm really ahead in life in this aspect.
As you can see, there's a lot of pluses for why you should start your own registered apprenticeship program. Today is going to be focusing more on where do I begin? And Scott will talk about this a little bit more as well, but you're always welcome to reach out to us at Women in Manufacturing that we could get you in touch with people like Jobs for the Future and Scott Ellsworth in order to start your own program and know where to go from there. So we're always here to help you. So feel free, use the QR code on the screen. Scott will also have a QR code later on for Jobs for the Future directly as well. We work hands in hands with them. So we think of us as like one little happy family here. So feel free to use either link and reach out to us, or feel free to email me, jamburn@womeninmfg.org. But without further ado, I would like to introduce Scott Ellsworth. He asked me to mention to everybody that he is smart and old in manufacturing. I say that he is the most intelligent person I have met when it comes to registered apprenticeship programs. He's been in manufacturing for over 25 years now, and he is my go-to person for how to start programs successfully and sustain them throughout the years. He has been doing starting registered apprenticeship programs with various companies for the past 10 years. So he has a wealth of knowledge, and we are so lucky to have him today to share with us. So without further ado, Scott, welcome.
Well, thanks, Jen. I really appreciate it. And she's right. I did say that I'm just a smart old guy. It means that I've been around the block and I've done this. I understand what it means to be an employer and to struggle with your workforce. And for the last 10 years, have been doing work in the workforce development apprenticeship space. And so that's all really a way that kind of gives me the experience to be able to share some of this with you today. So I am going to try and pull up my presentation, see if I'm smart enough to do that. All right. Hopefully I get a thumbs up from Jen that she can see this.
Looks great.
All right. Thank you, Jen. So again, as Jen said, and as the video said, the video shared a lot of the benefits of registered apprenticeship for employees. But we're going to talk today about kind of the benefit to you as an employer, how to get a program started, what are the steps that you need to take to be successful at this and make it work. But first, I would be remiss if I didn't at least introduce Jobs for the Future. I'm here on a contract with Jobs for the Future, which is contracted by the U.S. Department of Labor to help employers to build registered apprenticeships and implement them, understand what they are, et cetera. And so those partnerships have allowed us through the years to bring aboard hundreds of apprentices and actually thousands. And I say bring aboard, that's not to us, that's to bring aboard to companies. Companies get registered and bring those apprentices on. So you can go to that link. You can look at some information about JFF's contract with the DOL. They work primarily in manufacturing and agriculture, but we'll talk about some others here in a little bit. So today I want to tell you, just review registered apprenticeship. You've heard about apprenticeship now for 8-10 years. It's been kind of the buzzword, and that's because USDOL has really poured money into growing the system and helping people to understand it. And so hopefully you've got some of the basics of what registered apprenticeship is. We'll talk through it. I'm going to give you really the high points, but then we're going to talk about how do you make it happen. And the things that are here, I'm not going to go through them right now because I'll go through them in the presentation, but frequently people ask for a copy of the presentation. I wanted to make sure you've got kind of a list. This is sort of a step-by-step. You can build it out much more than this, but this gives you an opportunity to kind of understand what the steps are. So the next two slides are really the key to registered apprenticeship. This is a build it versus buy it strategy. Everybody who's been in business understands that buying employees today is harder than it has ever been. And that means that we're going out, we're all looking for the most qualified, the person that knows the job, and we're bringing them in. The change is that apprenticeship is a build it strategy. You're looking for people who are capable of learning. And this is something that frequently as businesses, we think we do, and we do, but we're missing the next component, which is the structure. So many companies are really good at doing the hands-on portion of the training. They're saying, I'm going to bring you in, I'm going to put you with somebody who's qualified, knows the job, and just learn everything that they have. We don't do the other side of it, which is the theoretical knowledge, kind of the schooling, if you want to say, but it doesn't have to be from a school. So really, if you learn nothing else about apprenticeship in the last 8 years, you should learn it's just a highly structured tool for building your own workforce. These are things you can do without registering. I will tell you that you probably won't if you don't register. The benefits for employers are incredible, but the single most important benefit to employers is the retention. I hear a lot of employers complain that, gosh, I hire people and they stayed 3 weeks, or I hired them and they stayed 3 months or 6 months, and then they took off. And a lot of times you'll hear employers say they took off for 50 cents. That really isn't usually what happens. Usually they take off because the company's not investing in them, or because they've got a problem with a manager or a supervisor. So with apprenticeship, what you're doing is you're giving them that structure. You're telling them day one what they're going to learn, what the expectations are of them, what the rewards are as they improve in their skills for the company. It engages the entire employee, not just the physical side of doing physical work, but it brings in their brain power as well. So a lot of times I would say to an employer, this is the step that is most important. It's the one that you could stop after, quite frankly, because if you choose the right partner, that's the way that apprenticeship gets built and works and all of that. You can see that I kind of like mountain climbing, thus I named our company Sherpa Management Solutions. The guy in the front there is the Sherpa. He's guiding them up the mountain, and that's really what this is about, is finding a navigator, a guide, somebody who leads you along the way. I used to just say to people, your way to build apprenticeship, call us. We'll take care of it. But there are a lot of people out there that are working on apprenticeship for you. There's your workforce board. There's the state multi-employer intermediaries. There are national intermediaries. We'll talk about them in a minute. There are state agencies. The USDOL has folks in many states. You've got centers of excellence, navigators, economic development, community colleges, chambers of commerce. What's important is that you find somebody who's been around apprenticeship, who has the time and the inclination to help you with all of the things we're about to talk about, because otherwise you have to become expert on apprenticeship, and none of you want to do that. You have day jobs, right? You're going to already be doing work that requires your attention every single day. So you want somebody who is focused on your registered apprenticeship, helps you to build it, helps you to understand the steps, and kind of walks you through those. I said I was going to mention the national industry intermediaries. And the reason I want to do this is USDOL has funded an enormous number of people to help you with your registered apprenticeship. These are, I say, a great place to start. I work with a number of them. They are exceptional, and they understand what it takes to build and implement an apprenticeship. But not only that, they understand who people are that they need to go to connect and draw into your team so that your local team is there for you long term. You can see all of the industries now that are covered by industry intermediaries: education, wireless, the care economy, construction, energy, transportation, manufacturing. I say manufacturing. A lot of people say advanced manufacturing. I would challenge you to find a manufacturer that is not advanced in what they do. And then even agriculture and jobs for the future is in the agriculture sector and the manufacturing sector. So these are people who are paid by USDOL, directly by your government dollars, to support you. They come to you at no cost to you, or no additional cost beyond your tax dollars that you're already paying. So let's talk about two critical elements that I think that you need to understand when you're going to build an apprenticeship. The first and most important thing is that you need buy-in beyond just you. Unless you're the CEO of the company and you can just tell everybody that we're buying into apprenticeship, you need the management team to understand and to appreciate and know what the benefits are. You need your operations team, you need your human resource team, you need all of these folks to understand what we're trying to do is build a structure that allows us to continue to have a solid workforce going on into the future. This doesn't fix your problem tomorrow. It helps with your problem tomorrow, but more importantly, this is a long-term strategy for you to always have a workforce and not be in the situation that likely you're in now, with a lot of people about to retire, and then you're just not going to have anybody that has the knowledge. The other thing I want to share with you, though, is that when you build your registered apprenticeship, you need to have an eye towards sustainability. Now, what does that mean? This is not, you're going to recycle people or you're going to reuse, or it's not all the things that we think of as sustainability in the energy sector or the products, but this is instead, how will my apprenticeship survived me. If I am the champion and I walked out tomorrow because I'm ready to retire and I take my knowledge with me, how is the business going to keep their apprenticeship going? It's not just money that keeps it going, but it's also commitment of people. And that's why you've got to have that buy-in from the management team early. When you've got that, then you have other people who they know how to get onto your system to be able to track apprentices and put information in. They know who the contact is at the workforce board. They know who your state apprenticeship training rep is. All of that is really important. You don't want to be a one-player band, because if you are, you leave and your apprenticeship is going to die. And that is not a good thing. So this is kind of like apprenticing yourself out. You're going to be the mentor for your next apprenticeship coordinator, an individual who does apprenticeship. So then there's decisions that you have to make. And remember, I told you, when you get a good guide and somebody who knows that, they're going to walk you through every single step of the way. They're going to help you understand what's the difference in our state where we are. Is this a state agency state, or is it a federally managed state with an Office of Apprenticeship? Whichever one it is, you want somebody who can help you to navigate that quagmire and just be able to get you to the right person. It's not hard to build an apprenticeship. It's only hard if you only do it once. And that's frequently what we say in registering apprenticeships is we say it's not hard to do. And then employers look at the level of complexity of things that I'm about to show you, and they say, oh, this is overwhelming. It's too hard for me to do. Again, if I was going to buy kitchen cabinets, I wouldn't try and build them myself. I'd go to somebody who had the right tools, had the knowledge, and the experience. That's what these folks are, and that's why a partner is so important to you. That partner is also going to talk to you about occupations. What's the occupation where you're struggling that you think building that and hiring from a more diverse community and larger community is going to help you? Should we think about joining a group program, or should we individually sponsor our program? A group program means that I'm going to join in with other employers under a single sponsor who's going to take care of administration, talking to the government, program reviews, all of that. And I'm just going to do my work, which is train people, give them the on-the-job training, make sure that they're getting to their classes, etc., and all of that. And so those are decisions that your guide is going to help you to make as to what's the benefit to you as a company of doing one versus the other, and how can we go about doing it? And do we have group sponsors even in our community? Going out and finding them is not always easy. They're not like at your forefront. There's no website that says find all your group sponsors in the United States. Each state has different websites. Some are really, really good. Some are a little more challenging. It's just like anything else. Then they're going to talk about time-based, competency, hybrid. What does all that mean? How is one more beneficial than the other? What does your state prefer? And so how can you get through the process most quickly? What works well in your organization? Do you have knowledge of what are the competencies somebody needs to have? Or do you have to sit down and define what those are? Do you think that time is the right way to go? Because if you're sitting in the job long enough, you know the job. Those are all questions that you have to answer. And again, you answer them with your partner, with your guide. And then the last is, do you want to, after your apprenticeship is built, do you want to start talking about how do I drive this a little further down into the system? How do I reach out to high schools with pre-apprenticeship? And how do I get some of these individuals into a pathway so that they really see, oh, when I graduate, I'm going straight into this apprenticeship and there's value in it for me, and I'm going to make money and I'm not going to have debt. And oh, by the way, I don't really like school that much anyhow, so I didn't want to go off to college. And you heard some of the folks in that video say, this was great for me. This was perfect. It allowed me to do things that I wanted to do with my life. So then you want to develop that occupation. So remember, we talked about what occupation is it that we want to build? Well, now you've got to sit down and think about, okay, what goes into that occupation? I always say there's two things. There's knowledge and there's skills. In apprenticeship, we call that related technical instruction, and we call it on-the-job learning. But all that is the knowledge of why you do things in the job and the practices of how you do them. So with that, as you sit and you think through that, you can either develop it on your own, or you can work with somebody who can help draw that out of you and get that information. The other thing you've got to do is, once you've defined the knowledge, you've got to figure out, how am I going to get that knowledge to my folks, my apprentices? Am I going to send them to a community college? Is that going to be for credit or not for credit? Am I going to use an online provider? Am I going to do it in-house and have classes in-house and talk through the theory of why we do things the way we do, or some mix of all of that? Then you want to decide on that wage schedule. And this is really one of the things that engages your employees, is the fact that you're paying them for the knowledge and skill they have. As they become more valuable to the business, you're sharing that value with them by increasing their wages. Your occupation, Appendix A, will define what does it take to get to that next step. Now, who amongst us wouldn't want to know exactly what we needed to do to get a raise, right? We need to be able to do A, B, and C. We have to be proficient in those. We have to be here for 6 months. Whatever that is, you know exactly what it is and what the progression looks like. And then the last component of building your occupation is, how are we going to choose people? This is not they need to be able to lift 50 pounds, have a driver's license. This is, what's the process look like? How are we going to go about finding people and interviewing them and bringing information in? Remember, what's important for this is that you're fair about how you do it. And you want to be sure that you're giving everybody an opportunity to get into your program. Because remember, you're not hiring for the skill they have today. You're hiring for their ability to gain the skill you need them to have. So then the last piece is implementation. You've got all of this paperwork and documentation done. You've got your standards done. They're turned into the state. The state has approved them. You're ready to rock and roll. So now it's implementation time, right? Well, the first question is, how do I get apprentices? Am I going to use incumbent workers? I'm going to follow that selection criteria and selection process that I built. So now, am I out looking for people off the street? Am I bringing them from my pre-apprenticeship in the high school? Am I just using people who have some experience with the company to move in? All of that. Then once I've got those, I want to work with my provider of related instruction, enroll them in school, get them on the learning management system, get them connected to whoever it is that's doing that training, and start doing that piece of it. This next step, the next two steps, are one that a lot of us lose track of. And that is choosing your mentors, your journey workers, and doing some sort of training with them. Frequently, what we did as an employer is we went to the individual who had the most experience and we said, you're going to mentor Scott. You're going to teach him everything you need to know. I came from manufacturing. 90% of the time, that was some old gruff guy that said, oh, you're so green and you're wet behind the ears and you don't really know anything. And, you know, and so he wasn't really set up to teach or to inform or to mentor or any of that. You can pick those people, but give them some training. That is a challenge that most apprenticeship programs struggle to overcome initially, is how do we get our mentors to be fully engaged in the learning of the individuals? And they may not always be the person who's been here the longest. They may not always be the person that you think, this is my best guy, my best woman. When I have trouble, I'm going to them to do the work. You want somebody who's able to bring your people along. You don't want to scare them away. You don't want them to feel like this is a horrible environment in which they came to work. You want them to feel engaged, learning, and progressing. Figuring out record keeping, this is not hard. Most record keeping is really simple database, keeping demographic information, tracking in your facility how people are completing. You've got some sort of learning management system or some way of tracking how they're doing in their related instruction. Frequently, if they're going to a community college, the college is taking care of that, and you just want to have access to it. But then on the job training side, are you doing competencies? How are you measuring those? How are you keeping track of what those competencies are? If it's time, is it just timesheets? You're just keeping track of that? How do you know that they're getting an opportunity to see all of the parts of the business that you need them to see? So remember, back to that structure that you built in the Appendix A, you've listed out, these are all of the things that somebody needs to see. Okay, these are all of the experiences someone needs to have. And then the last and something really important that we don't want to lose track of is celebrating the success. Celebrating is so important to these folks because remember, they're making, as an apprentice, a commitment to you, to your business, and to their own futures. This is as difficult and as important as getting a college diploma. And I would almost say maybe more important because you're actually learning how to do things, not just why you do it. So having a college diploma, you understand a lot of book knowledge, all of those things, but frequently we'll hear employers say, well, they're really, really smart, but they don't know how to do anything. That feels a little bit like a disconnect. And it is because they don't have work experience. That's what apprenticeship gives you. And it's really the opportunity for you to say, you've done something that is really important to us as a business. We're really happy that you did. And we're very proud of you. Frame their journey worker credential. Let them hang it up on their wall. Let them hang it there. Put a list up in the shop, whatever you do, but make sure you celebrate them. Okay. So we talked about kind of getting a more diverse population. This isn't an initiative to get more diversity just to have more diversity. What this is that you are now able to recruit from a much broader pool of candidates. I will say all the time to a large group of people, how many people in here know how to do, I love saying rebuild a car engine. Inevitably, it's a very small handful of people that are fully competent and capable of doing that. That's your recruiting pool if you're looking for people who are qualified. But when you change that to what an apprenticeship allows you to do, which is to look for people who can learn how to rebuild an engine, 85 to 90% of the hands go up in the room. And your pool is much broader because you've committed to a training program that you've defined gets somebody to being fully competent. The other component of that is still looking for the source of this information, but apparently there are 30% more applicants to jobs that have structured training with them. If anybody knows where that statistic is, I would love to have it, and I'd ask you to send it to me because I love quoting it. It's a way for employers to understand, hey, when I say I'm committed to my employees, more people want to work for me. This is the last thing that I want to leave you with. There is not enough money for you to sustain your business on in building an apprenticeship. What apprenticeship brings is the value of building a workforce, and that's what keeps you in business. You need to have a successful workforce. You need people who are competent, who understand their job, who are effective at it. Don't think that, oh, I heard there's an incentive from the state of $3,500 tax incentive. This is great. It may last 2 or 3 or 5 or maybe 10 years, but someday that will go away. That's not built for sustainability. That is icing on the cake. That is a benefit that you get from having built a program. But the real value in that program, the real reason that you need to do it is because your workforce has to be qualified, and you want a structured way to do that for them. That's what apprenticeship is. But remember, if you go back to the one thing that I started in the entire presentation, find a partner. Find somebody who can guide you through this process. Don't try and figure it out on your own, because if you do, you're going to spend a lot of hours doing it. You're going to get frustrated. You're going to say, this is incredibly hard. You find a partner that can help you through the process and that does that work, you're going to be fine. And they'll guide you through that. They'll get you there. You'll be really happy with the outcome. And then you can have that celebration. So Jen, that's kind of the how-to. Now let's see what kind of questions people have.
Well, first of all, Scott, that was a wonderful presentation. And I know people are going to have questions because it's a lot of information and it's a lot to kind of digest and everything. I have a couple of questions for you to kind of kick us off. But I think the big one is you talking about sustainability. As the middle-aged person in me, I always think sustainability is the green, but in this sense, it's a completely different type of mindset. Can you talk about like sustainability with registered apprenticeship programs?
So again, sustainability really comes down to how is the program built that it will survive beyond a champion. So putting that structure into the program that people accept and believe in, that it's easy to do, and helping more than one person to actually do the work and get into the system, be able to track things. Don't be the sole point of contact for anything. Don't think that holding on to that knowledge makes you more valuable. It actually makes you less valuable because you're holding the company back. So that's really what I mean by sustainability for this. Don't build it for the money. Understand that you've built this for the workforce. Money's a bonus. It's great to have some tax incentives. It's great to have a little bit of incentive funds. But again, that all just kind of comes afterward and helps later. And I did see in the chat that a friend from United Grinding said that they built a program. It's even easier. Now, what they're saying, though, is that they partnered with Sinclair Community College. So United Grinding is a builder of grinding machines. We had one at the company that I ran. They were up the road from us in Dayton, Ohio. They worked with their community college, Sinclair, in 3 months. Boom, done. Now, I'm going to bet that if United Grinding had tried to do that only on their own, without any help, it might have been a little more of a challenge. So thank you, Sinclair. That's great.
Yeah, community colleges really are a great place to start, especially for like the smaller manufacturers who may not have the infrastructure and everything like that, to partner with local community colleges and get that ball rolling. So thank you, Andrea, for sharing that with us. I get this question a lot, Scott, and I kind of want to get your thoughts on it. So I think a lot of our guests are in either like recruiting or HR or growing programs like that. And you may go, this is great. I really want to do a registered apprenticeship program, but how do I get buy-in from upper management? How do I get this ball rolling with them? Is there some tried and true thing that they can maybe think of or do, or steps they could take?
Well, there's no easy way to convince somebody to do anything. Unless you know what their pain is and you can help them to understand that what this will do to help take that pain away. The key is, again, to understand how apprenticeship is of value to the business. What's the business case? Because if apprenticeship's not doing something to make the business better, then no company wants to do it because it feels like it's just another program. It feels like it's cost. And so this is a place, again, where your guide can help you if you need to go to your management team. Now, how many of us have had this experience, right? We say something over and over and over again. Nobody hears it. We bring a consultant in, and it's like they're the smartest person in the world. Well, this is a way to do that. There are people that are you don't even have to pay them as consultants because they're there to help you do this. Bring them in. Everybody thinks that they're brilliant, and unfortunately, that kind of makes you feel like, gosh, nobody listens to me. But long and the short of it is, you've gotten that apprenticeship going.
Yeah, yeah, those are all great points, Scott. So we do have some questions in the chat. Um, this one is a little bit longer, so bear with me. But Cindy asked, some objections I have heard in manufacturing, like reps will open the door to unions, perhaps because unions were largely the ones to use this model, or RAP is upskilling people so other larger companies can poach them. Do you have any suggestions on overcoming these concerns?
Well, the first thing that I say to companies, just let me share with you though, we did build a program, national program with the lumber industry. These are massive companies that we all know. They complained that the small companies were poaching their people. So everybody complains that somebody's poaching their people. What I'm going to tell you is, nobody is leaving a company because they're smarter and know better how to do their job. They're leaving the company because they don't like their supervisor. They don't like the culture of the company. There's something that they don't feel comfortable with, and they're moving on. It's usually not pay, and it's usually not because you trained them. The disadvantage, of course, is if you don't train them, they're non-productive. They give you lots of scrap. They cause customers to be unhappy. And all they're doing is they're a cost center, not a profit center. So that's really what I say to folks who are talking about people getting poached. Now, the other component of that is that, who cares? I know how to make more. I know how to train people up and get them to be fully competent. And if they want to leave, good for them, good for my local economy. I know how to get somebody there again, and it's not the end of the world. What will happen is people will see that attitude. They'll stay because you obviously value your team. You might lose one or two. Those are people you are going to lose regardless of whether you trained them. I've heard somebody say, and this is a congresswoman has it as a signature line in her email, and I can't remember who it was, but she says, train people so that they can leave. Treat them so that they want to stay. And that's really how you keep people. It's not about whether you train them or you don't train. As far as the union question, I get that. Yes, unions were really early adopters, and they were excellent at choosing apprenticeship as a way to train people up. They saw the value of it early on. But this is not a union program. This is something that you do as a company. You pull it together, you structure it, you define it, you define whether people go forward or they don't go forward. You define what it takes for somebody to come on board. All of those are your decisions. You can still terminate them if they're a terrible employee. You can still promote them early if you think that they're fantastic. None of that is defined for you. And so really there is not a connection between union and apprenticeship. It's really between growing my workforce, building my workforce, and apprenticeship.
Yeah, these are all great points. We do have another question. Somebody asked if you were familiar with the Gains Initiative.
So I am going to say, this may be, I hope that I'm right, in particular to New Jersey for sure. I was just on with a client of ours that has marinas all over the United States. They have a program in Florida that they now want to take to the Northeast, and they have chosen to go to New Jersey. And I was on with the Office of Apprenticeship Rep, and he was saying that this is about growing apprenticeship and non-traditional skills, I think is what it was. And that there's some funding for that, at least particular to New Jersey. beyond that, that's what I've heard. And so I'm not sure if there's something else to that.
Yeah, and it was sent anonymously, but whoever sent that question in, if you want to reach out to me, we could do more research on it and work with you on that. So feel free to shoot me an email. I'll put my email in the chat, and so that you were able to reach out to me later if you would so like. Um, so Scott, I mean, you and I know we work closely with Jobs for the Future, and I know that their services are free and they're great partner to work with. But I don't know if everybody knows this, and so my question for you is like, there's a lot of work that goes into this, but can we talk about how a partnership with an intermediary? I still struggle with that word. With like Jobs for the Future, how can they help you bridge this gap and get you started and help you along the way?
So there are as many models on how people go to market with intermediaries as there are intermediaries. There are some intermediaries who operate as a national sponsor, and you sign on for their national program. It's super easy. You're signing an employer agreement. You're administering the program kind of to rules that they've helped to define that are good across the country. And that's a really quick way to do it and been super effective. There's an intermediary who's got more than 25,000 registered apprentices since the day that this began 10 years ago. So, and they have done an exceptional job in their industry. There are others, including JFF, who how they go to market is that they support the employer to build their own or to join an apprenticeship program. So JFF does not serve as a sponsor. Instead, they're purely technical assistants. And then there are other intermediaries who are somewhere in between. But really what you've got is that each intermediary is working in generally different sectors. They're working generally differently in how they approach employers, but all of them have that technical knowledge of registered apprenticeship and connections that are really helpful. So probably the thing I would say that's most important about the intermediaries is just that relationship and their network and their ability to quickly get you the answers that you need, as opposed to if you go out and you just start searching the web, type in apprenticeship, you're going to get inundated with information and you're going to be reading for days, and you may not be any more knowledgeable when you get done than when you started. So reach out to somebody and let them help you.
Absolutely. And Scott, I don't see any other questions coming in, but I do want to end up on the singing your praises. Megan from Intel messaged us and said that she couldn't have launched their program without you, semi.org, local community college, and nonprofit organizations. And she totally agrees with everything you said. So, of course, I wanted to sing your praises because you have done such a wonderful job for us here today and gave us such a wealth of information to take home and digest. I put my email address in the chat. Feel free to reach out to me at any time. Scott is always willing and able to help people as well. So feel free, reach out to us, especially with Women in Manufacturing Jobs for the Future. Our services are 100% free. And if we don't know the answer, we're going to find the answers for you. So please don't hesitate. I can't stress enough. Our services are free. Please use us. We're very passionate about this and helping women in manufacturing to get out there and join registered apprenticeship programs. So Scott, unless you have anything else, I do want to thank you and once again for doing this for us today and getting us all this information.
Well, I'm happy to do it, Jen, and I appreciate the opportunity. And it's a privilege to talk to people about registered apprenticeship.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And thank you everybody today for giving up your time and sitting in on this. I hope you got out of it as much as I got out of it. And if I will be putting this on our YouTube page, and I will send everybody who registered a link to that. So if you want to share this with other people, feel free. If you want to go back and catch some snippets you may have missed, feel free as well. But in the meantime, feel free to reach out to us if you have any questions. So thank you, everybody. And Scott, thank you
Thank you
so
all for
much.
being here. And thanks,
All
Jen.
right. Take care, everyone.
Bye-bye.